Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is the Vulgar Marxist. As I sit here in my comfy new chair, and by comfy and new I mean recently dumpster dived from some idiot who does not understand that sewing a zipper onto a cushion is all of 10 minutes work. But I digress. As I sit here in my reasonably new chair, I am forced to meditate upon the exigencies of the age in which we live. I had originally intended this morning to make a video about a dust-up on our socialism, in which the original poster did not merely not understand the concept of innate value of commodities, the entire board utterly and completely failed to coherently understand that commodity fetishization has nothing to do with commodities having value, but rather the obsession of economists with measuring the volume of commodities produced rather than their distribution. I had everything ready for it. Pictures. I don't bother writing dialogue. I tend to fly off the cuff. But I was quite ready to make that video this morning. And then I log on to find that Libertarian Socialist Rants has started his channel again. Now, I am not a fan of Libertarian Socialist Rants. His propensity to ignore any substance or nuance in his arguments, his use of shaming language rather than evidence or fact or logic, his consistent positioning of feminism ahead and above of socialism, anarchism, or very nearly anything else, were all put on staggering display in the video I watched this morning. Now, I am not going to address the video directly, other than to contest his point regarding the idea that sexual liberation and class liberation are necessarily synonymous, by pointing to the excruciatingly simple combination of facts that 1. The overwhelming majority of pregnancies are unplanned, 2. Babies cost something in the range of $250,000 over the course of their adolescence, and 3. Brood parasites are a thing. The context of these assertions was a YouTube video that is very nearly the opposite of the issues I am currently addressing, wherein Libsoc, and I'm going to call him Libsoc because frankly he's a sock puppet at this point, Libsoc attempts to argue that feminism needs anarchism without even once pausing to consider the question of whether or not anarchism needs feminism. I'm afraid we're going to have to put up with the loud cries of dissent from the toddlers in the apartment complex I live in. In any event, my goal in this, my second video, in my Why Feminism Cannot Be Socialist series, will be dedicated to the propensity of feminism to degrade, insult, and wherever possible erase the struggles of working people. And this is not in any way tangential to feminism. The first 5 or 6 points on any male privilege checklist invariably revolve around the concept that being coercively forced to sell your labor under threat of starvation is some amazing benefit for which men should be measurably grateful. To say nothing of the obsession with getting women into positions of authority, which absolutely no one should have any right to be in the first place, coupled with the fact that the overwhelming majority of workplace accidents and injuries are one gender, and one gender exclusively, and that gender is most certainly not female. So it was a particular sense of outrage I felt when I realized exactly the scale of erasure the article Libsoc was citing represented. This is not merely an attack upon workers' rights. It is the erasure of the concept that workers' rights exist. It is the shuffling of the goalposts to such a level that no one can possibly be understood as a member of the laboring class. The lowering of the standard of what constitutes class privilege to the point where no one is outside of it. That it is impossible for workers to be exploited because the mere act of working is itself a privilege. The mere act of eating food is itself a privilege. The mere act of living in a house or riding on public transit is so glorious and grand that anyone should be grateful merely to possess them. This is utterly and completely disgusting. But no, don't take my word for it. Let's read the article. Let's see what the article says. Would you look at that? Being able to sleep is now a class privilege. Only a tiny handful get a good night's sleep each night. Despite decades, oh wait, no, nearly a century of workers' struggle to reduce the working day to reasonable and sane levels. The idea of being able to get 6 to 8 hours of sleep a night is some ridiculous and outrageous thing that no one has any right to reasonably expect. The campaign for the 8-hour day was one of the greatest triumphs early socialists had. The idea that workers should not have to spend 14 to 16 hours every day slowly killing themselves for the benefits of others, that they had the right to a good night's sleep and time off to do what they wish to do, is possibly the greatest achievement the labor movement ever accomplished. And yet in one fell swoop, this article destroys not merely the idea of 8 hours rest, but 8 hours to do what we will. Do the authors earnestly believe that people should go back to working 14, 16, 18 hours a day simply to put bread on their table? And how dare anyone attempt to claim that people making such assertions have the right to call themselves socialist or be associated with socialism in any way? But oh no, it does not stop here. It does not even remotely stop here. Of the number of roommates I have had, a significant portion very nearly lived off of fast food. Not because they didn't enjoy cooking, because, quite frankly, they didn't have time to cook. Between their work schedule, their school schedule, taking care of various children, they simply did not have the 45 minutes necessary to prepare a meal every day. A single mother I knew, in fact more than a couple, frequently ordered takeout very nearly every night because she simply could not take the time to cook and prepare food. Furthermore, a number of people I worked with lived in apartments that not merely did not have a refrigerator, did not have an oven, and one of the conditions of the lease agreement was do not install a hot plate. This stipulation, coupled with the previous one, is what is called a catch-22. If the worker has a job which allows them the luxury of cooking meals themselves, and therefore almost certainly lets them sleep 6 to 8 hours necessary rest, they have class privilege because they get to sleep. If the worker's job does not allow them 6 to 8 hours of rest, and therefore almost certainly does not allow them the time to make home-cooked meals, they have class privilege because they're forced to eat out. Again, this article is not about bringing attention to class privilege. It is about erasing the identity of the underclass. It is about demonstrating that everyone has class privilege, so no one can be oppressed by capitalism. It is patiently obvious horse shit. But no, you don't have to believe me yet. It continues. Oh, it keeps going so far. Let's continue, shall we? Yes, ladies and gentlemen, having to take a day off from work because you are vomiting is class privilege. I have worked in a variety of industries, everything from grocery stores to fast food restaurants, clothing stores, truck driving, various go-between jobs. And there are a significant number of places where not only are you not going to be required to come to work if you are sick, it is a violation of local, state, and federal laws for you to go to work if you are sick. As a truck driver, I have something called a FedMed card, which is a card that I must keep with my license on my person at all times, testifying in a legal document that can be brought to court as evidence that I am healthy enough to drive my truck. If I am not healthy enough to drive my truck, I am required under federal law to tell my employer I am not healthy enough to drive my truck, at which point I am placed out of service, sat wherever I am without pay. Doesn't matter if I'm in a parking lot of a shipper, parking lot of a truck stop, wherever I am, I have to stay there, no pay, until I am healthy enough to work again. Now, this isn't just something with truck drivers. Food services, grocery stores, fast food, childcare, healthcare, all of these have either state, municipal, or federal laws stipulating you cannot work if you have a communicable disease. Now, granted, most fast food restaurants couldn't possibly care less whether you have a communicable disease, but that does not mean the worker is deriving a benefit from their employers unilaterally ignoring the laws of the city, state, or country in which they reside. This is not a benefit to the worker. This is a benefit to the employer. And the fact that this article confuses these things, again, speaks volumes about the author's understanding of class struggle. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, riding the bus is a class privilege. Never mind the fact that every single employer I've ever heard of has a stipulation as a condition of employment that you must be able to get to the job. That very frequently you are required to sign a piece of paper saying you have ready means of transportation to get to and from work, otherwise you are fired. Never mind that I have, in point of fact, seen multiple people fired from their job because their car broke down and they couldn't come to work for 3 or 4 days, because their only means of transportation was disabled. No, no, no. Having the ability to get to work at all is a privilege. And in that context, this one is really particularly egregious because, again, we are back to the issue of working at a job is privilege. I repeat, every employer I have ever heard of has a stipulation as a condition of employment: you must have readily available means of transportation or you are fired. So, by logical extension, if having the ability to get to your job is a privilege, and you will not continue to have that job if you cannot get to it, then logically, having a job must also be a privilege. Which means we have once more returned to the construction that being coercively forced under threat of starvation to continue selling your labor regardless of whether you want to or not, regardless of whether you benefit or not, regardless of whether you receive a fraction of the value your labor creates in wages, is an enormous and unmeasurable blessing for which you should be eternally grateful. And yet these people think they're socialists, when they have less than no coherent understanding of anything our movement has stood for. There is a city to the north of me that a century ago was famous for its advocacy for wide-scale public works projects. Sewers, paved roads, street lights, public education, public housing, streetcars, buses, transportation, anything they could think of that would benefit working people, they gladly and happily put on the city's tab, confident that the increase in productivity would more than pay for the expense. And it was understood very clearly by the socialists of that time and age that access to these things was not a privilege for the few, but rather a right of the many. That clean, safe living conditions, the ability to get to and from a healthy and reciprocally beneficial workplace, was to be expected in a modern industrial society, that people should not have to wade through their own shit simply to put bread on their table. Yet where has this sentiment gone? Where are these socialists now? Not at everyday feminism, that's for goddamn certain. I mean, holy fuck, look at that first sentence. We can reasonably expect to be paid at the rate we agreed on. Agreed on with whom? I don't recall negotiating for a salary at any job I've ever worked. I remember getting told, we will pay you $7.50 an hour to cut up vegetables. We will pay you $6.75 an hour to sort dirty laundry. We will pay you $5.60 an hour to cut up fish. We will pay you 45 cents a mile to drive a truck. Would you like to hear about detention pay? Do you know what detention pay is? Oh, that's so much fun. Detention pay is something in the trucking industry where if you are delayed at a shipper, you get paid for the fact that you're not able to drive any miles. You have to sit there and get nothing. Now, the first company I worked for, I don't even remember what their detention policy was. I wasn't there long enough. The second company had this wonderfully fun policy where you would only get paid after waiting for 2 hours past your appointment time, but only if you showed up before your appointment. And yes, I would very frequently sit through a 2, 3, 4 hour live unload completely for free without getting a penny in money for me having to be there, because I'm not driving, so I'm not getting paid. But all of this ignores a larger point. And I've already covered this point in a previous video, and frankly, as much as I have to sometimes, I do not enjoy repeating myself, so we're just going to repeat that segment I've already done in a lovely copy-paste. Enjoy, ladies and gentlemen.
Suppose now the worker were to refuse to yield to the coercion of any employer, but were to choose instead to remain under the legal duty to abstain from the use of any of the money which anyone owns. He must eat. While there is no law against eating in the abstract, there is a law which forbids him to eat any of the food which actually exists in the community. The law is the law of property. It can be lifted by any specific food at the discretion of its owners, but if the owners unanimously refuse to lift the prohibition, the non-owner will starve unless he can himself produce food. And there is every likelihood that the owners will be unanimous in refusing if he has no money. There is no law to compel them to part with their food for nothing. Unless then the non-owner can produce his own food, the law compels him to starve if he has no wages, and compels him to go without wages unless he obeys the behest of some employer. It is the law that coerces him into wage work under the penalty of starvation, unless he can produce food. Can he? Here again, there is no law to prevent the production of food in the abstract. But in every settled country where there is law which forbade him to cultivate any particular piece of ground unless he happens to be the owner. This again is the law of property. And this again will not be likely to be lifted unless he already has money. that way of escape from the law-made dilemma of starvation or obedience is closed to him. It may seem that one way to escape has been overlooked, the acquisition of money in some other way than by wage work. Can he not make money by selling goods? But here again, things cannot be produced in quantity sufficient to keep him alive except with the use of elaborate mechanical equipment. To use any such equipment would be unlawful except on the owner's terms. Those terms usually would include an implied abandonment of any claim of title to the products. In short, if he not be a property owner, the law which forbade him to produce with any of the existing equipment and the law which forbade him to eat any of the existing food will only be lifted in case he works for an employer. It is the law of property which coerces people into working for factory owners.
I do not know what screaming, spackle-brained incompetent wrote that article, other than the person's name at the top, but I have no clue who they are. But 30 minutes of research on any major economic forum will very quickly reveal that the wages you are receiving do not remotely reflect the amount of effort you have put in at work and have not reflected for quite some time. And further, another 30 minutes of effort will very quickly reveal that the entirety of this collapse has occurred at the expense of men for no gain by women at all. You have not openly and freely negotiated for your wages. There was no agreement in any meaningful sense of that term. Your wages do not reflect the amount of effort you are putting in at work, nor the productive value you are creating. And furthermore, not only are feminists not interested in addressing this point, they are actively cheering the collapse of males' economic agency as some form of victory. Closing the wage gap, they call it. Yes, you are closing that gap, but not the way you think you are. Or maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's exactly the way they intend to close that gap, because once again, we are staring at a catch-22. Who remembers the second item on this list? Having to buy fast food, garbage, in packaged form because you did not have enough time in the day to cook meals yourself is a privilege. And now, going to the grocery store to cook the meals yourself is also a privilege. What an exquisite trap, ladies and gentlemen, if you have to order food from a store because you don't have time to cook it yourself, you have class privilege. If you're able to take the time to cook the food yourself, you also have class privilege, on top of the fact that if you actually get a reasonable amount of sleep on any given night, that too is class privilege. It's almost like we are trying to define class privilege in terms so broad that absolutely every single person everywhere has it, and there is therefore no reason to pay the least shred of attention to working people at all. I could go into a very long diatribe here about how most of the areas impacted by food deserts are in the rural southern United States, and most of the people these articles are aimed at are increasingly in urban areas if last year's election dynamics are any measure. But frankly, I don't have the time or the energy. I would hope it is now staggeringly self-evident that articles like this are nothing more than a pathetically transparent attempt to deflect attention away from the struggles of working people. We have seen 2, possibly 3 catch-22s defining class privilege in terms so broad that very nearly anyone and everyone would qualify. There is a quotation that I absolutely love, and I have yet to find the source of. If society is a banquet laid out for the few, with the many forced to fight over the scraps that fall to the floor, then my goal is not the rearranging of the occupants of the chairs. It is the abolition of the table itself. What we have just witnessed is someone whose sole concern is changing who is sitting in which chairs, and rationalizing to all those below why this benefits them, or even more outrageously, why they benefit from this rearrangement. I do not benefit from changing who the elites are. I benefit from there no longer being elites. I would have hoped this was a sentiment Libsoc shared, but it is now painfully obvious that he is much a part of the problem as the author of this article. I could be wrong. Please, sir, if I have misconstrued your arguments, present them more clearly. But as of right now, as far as I am concerned, you are not an anarchist. You are not a socialist. You are a sock puppet of a gang of criminals desiring only to change who the elites are.